YouTube, Rabbi?
I am. I can see that I am.
Okay, okay, then it's just me.
I'm gonna mute you as well now that it's all being recorded and everything. Um, I'm gonna start for the next couple minutes, just sharing the slide with all the wonderful people and organizations that have sponsored this, and then we'll start. So as you see this slide, don't think that uh, the class is off for the day. We are absolutely on. We're just thanking all of our sponsors who have made this course possible and have shared it through their own network. And it's great to have so many organizations that are just backing up this kind of teaching and this kind of class that is, as we are finding out, really needed right now. So we're going to leave that up for another minute, and then we'll get started. All right. And it's not just those great organizations that have sponsored this course. It's also each and every one of you who have found this course worthwhile and have made donations. As you know, this is offered completely for free, but it's very rewarding to see so many of you who have been able to share a little bit of your abundance to support this work, this important work. And please continue to do so. We are going to be together through the end of February, so there's still time. And we're getting right now to modernity. We're getting really right now into the era that concerns us directly. So hopefully you'll find your way. Maybe Shelly can post here in the chat room the link to our donation page. That would be helpful, and that can help you find your way to make whatever donation, or if you already made a small donation, made another small donation, whatever you can, whatever you are able to do. All right. We're going to keep an eye on those who are still joining us on Zoom. I think in the meantime, we're ready to go. So as always, we'll start with opening the space with a chant of wholeness. The word shalom means wholeness. The word shalom means harmony, and everybody knows that it also means peace. And those are the kinds of energies that we can bring into the space wherever we are here together through the ether of the interweb. So close your eyes and gently find your breath. And just let go of the day that was, that you might be completely present to this moment we will share together. And from that space, I invite you to draw a breath for shalom. Shalom. רצון אמרתי והגיון ליבי לפניך, Adonai. Holy One of Being, help us to know your presence right here, right now. That the words of our mouth, the meditations of our hearts might flow from the fullness of your being, Holy One. Adonai Tzuri v'Go'ali, you are source, Holy One, and you are destination. Amen. So as always, we have a lot to cover. And I am, as always, determined to let all of us go by 8:30. So here we go. Thank you, Shelley, for posting the link in the chat room. This is the 6th class, believe it or not. We've covered almost 2,000 years of history at this point. And we are entering now into the changes that happened in the 17 and 1800s. And we're going to stop right around the First World War in the beginning of the 20th century. And I know that I already spent some time on this in the previous session, but they're kind of build on each other. During our last session, I spent a lot of time talking about the Jewish question, if you remember, what in German is called the Judenfrage. The Judenfrage. And the question was about whether Jews were fit enough, educated enough, loyal enough to be citizens of these emerging nation states of Europe that were born in the 1700s and began their growth pains, I would say, through the 1800s. And I talked about the Jews' own answers to the Judenfrage, to the Jewish question, and I specifically mentioned as one of them what was known as, what became known as the Haskalah movement, which is also known as the Jewish Enlightenment. And though there is something very powerful about a people taking its destiny into its own hands and creating a whole movement to support the transition of its people from an ostracized, marginalized, ghettoized nation to a fully functioning, a fully participating nation into this new emancipated, modern, secular world. And there is also something very, I would say, distressing about it. And what is most distressing about it is that by doing so, the leaders of the Haskalah, those Jewish leaders, basically acknowledged, not just acknowledged, but agreed with and even justified the anti-Semitic stereotypes of their time. They affirmed with their Christian neighbors that the Jews were indeed a backward, uneducated, unfit people who really needed to be re-educated, who really needed to be lifted up from the dark ages where they still dwell, a people that still needed to be improved. And if you hear that, you know that those are very similar tropes as the racist ones used around the emancipation of Black Americans that you may be more, familiar with. But in this case, these elite Jews who led the Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, were overtly or covertly siding with their anti-Semitic detractors. Now we can ask, were they themselves anti-Semites? Were they self-hating Jews, as we are often too quick to label people? And most scholars, most historians would say not at all, not at all. But what happened was that they had integrated as truth, consciously or unconsciously, the anti-Jewish worldview of their time, which was the water they were swimming in. And it's true that every minority everywhere, more or less, falls prey to these kinds of pitfalls. And we will see, in fact, how this manifests today as well. Now, tonight I want to talk about modern anti-Semitism. Modern anti-Semitism, just like its preceding versions, seek to attribute contemporary social and political ills to the Jews. Right? Just like in the past, everything that's wrong with your society, who is responsible for it? The Jews. But because of that, because of this new modern anti-Semitism, those attacks led the Jews to actually become very involved in politics in the countries where they lived. And their impulse for that, the impulse that moved them to start running for office and get involved, is that they were hoping to forge a broad variety of responses to this wide variety of accusations that were directed at them. Contrary to its predecessors, this version of anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism, is mostly secular. Though, as we will see, not exclusively so, but it is mostly secular, and it grounds its claims in the notion that, as we will see, there exists a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. Paradoxically, it feels somewhat echoing the Inquisition, which was a response of the church to its fears of having been infiltrated by those fake converted Jews whose ultimate goal, they surmised, was to gain control of the church. Eerily, though the actors and the players are different, the trope, the background of the anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic tropes really kind of repeats itself. And in the 19th, and then we'll see obviously in the 20th century, Europe's political parties were, and I mean that literally, founded to oppose Jews. They were literally the basis of their existence was to oppose Jews. And there was a flourishing of anti-Semitic ideologues and politicians who were eager to turn hatred of Jews really into full-time jobs. And through that, to be elected, to get votes, and to be elected. Now, in the 1800s, there is a new radical right that is born. And that radical right is composed of clerics, monarchists, nationalists, university students, as well as lower middle class folks who were especially receptive to anti-Semitism. Now, on the political left, the focus was on attacking individual Jews. And that's where you start to hear a lot about the, from the left, attacks against the capitalists. And at the time, the capitalists that represented the Jews was the Rothschild family. You start to see attacks on the left on the Jewish bankers, the stock market brokers, right? And any Jew who engages in commerce, in even petty trade, even in peddling, right? The left sees any expression of capitalism, small or global, as a major problem and blame the Jews for it. So you can already see that Jews are attacked both on the right and on the left. All of that in the context of, the beginning of democracies, the beginning of the society that actually had parties. Sorry. Paradoxically, again, I'm starting to use that word a little too much. Anti-Semitism was an ideology that was in fact often able to unite people, all peoples of a country who would be ordinarily divided along class as well as religious or political lines. As is often the case, if we have a shared enemy, then that unites us in that specific area of our lives. And what everyone rallied around, even cross borders, we see that throughout Europe, was, as I mentioned earlier, the Judenfrage, the Jewish question. Now, how does that exactly manifest? I'm going to give some examples, because I think what you see and what you will see here is that it starts to really revolve around people, around individuals that are creating movements, that are creating political parties. And one very famous is a German Protestant whose name is Bruno Bauer, B-A-U-E-R, who in 1843 wrote a pamphlet, an essay, that he titled, of course, The Jewish Question, right? I guess that was in the air. And in this pamphlet, in this essay, in this publication, he decried what he saw as the Jews' wish to enter the modern world without first surrendering their distinctive culture. the Jews, kind of in his words, were refusing to disappear. And because of this unwillingness to disappear among the masses, that caused the Gentiles' opposition to them. And so in his argument, if you heard what I just said, he was actually blaming the Jews themselves for the hostility that they inspired. I guess they inspired him specifically, but then a lot of his followers. And so in this publication he writes, as long, and I quote, as long as he is a Jew, his Jewishness must be stronger in him than his humanity, and keep him apart from non-Jews. Right? So Jewishness, it seems, according to him, is other than one's humanity. Very fascinating worldview as he splits that. Right? If you want to be a full human, I guess, as I am reading this, you would need to let go of your Jewishness. And so Bauer claimed that the Jews possess what he called an immutable collective loyalty and essence. The Jews possess an immutable collective loyalty and essence. And that collective loyalty, what unites them obviously across borders because they are loyal to their own kind, if you want, right? And that connects the Jews wherever they are. This accusation of that immutable collective loyalty that is the Jewish essence, as he writes, this accusation furthers the notions of Jewish global subversion and Jewish global plot of control. Now, this was just a new secular modern version of, as we've seen, ancient tropes. Rome spoke of the Jews as distrusting, disliking, or even hating the rest of humanity. The church, as we spent a lot of time describing that over the earlier part of the course, the church decried the Jews as evil, obstinate, unable to accept the light of Jesus, and accusing them of fomenting hatred against Christianity. And as we will see in a couple weeks, Muslim thinkers similarly accused the Jews of refusing to accept the Prophet Muhammad. And so we have a mix here in the 1800s. We have a mix of ancient, and because they are ancient, they are also already accepted anti-Semitic tropes with modern prejudices against the Jews. And that together really creates a very potent blend of accusations, of charges that are going to emerge with great strength all the way through the closing decades of the 1800s, the 19th century. But understand, I think I mentioned that last session, that a lot of that anti-Semitism was in fact a conversation that modern people were having amongst themselves in the early days of those nation states as to what this really was and who belonged and what was everyone's place in it. And we see that though the Jews were the target of everyone's ire, modern anti-Semitism, and that's really important to know, modern anti-Semitism was in fact a sharp critique of the nature of modern society. that was projected onto the Jews. And I'll talk more about that. But that's really key to understand that anti-Semitism was, and I repeat here because it's critical, was a sharp critique of the nature of modern society that was projected onto the Jews. Now, I want you to kind of think about and get a picture of what Europe in the 1800s looked like, because it's not the Europe that maybe you visited in the last few decades, whenever you were able to make your way there. I mean, think of Europe in the early to the mid 1800s as as Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, for example. Think about Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. Right? Picture London and Paris in those days. Cobblestone streets, right? Horse, buggies, It's the time of the great migration from the villages where people lived for generations and worked the fields for generations. Suddenly they are uprooted and moved to the big cities. And now they're working in the mines, underground instead of above ground. Or they're working in the factories. At the time, think about child labor. No social protection. It's the chaotic bursting of rogue capitalism, right? Think about the poverty of the time. Think about the pollution in those cities. Think about the fact that there were no workers' protection, no 40-hour work week, no health care, right? That's how those societies were evolving at the peak of industrialization. And so the Jew was the easy scapegoat for anyone infuriated with unbridled capitalism, and if not that, Marxism, and if not that, liberalism, and if not that, communism, ethnic exclusiveness, cosmopolitan universalism, obviously, like I mentioned, the uprooting of peasantry, but also the waste of colonization that is happening at the same time. The strikes and the revolts in Europe, in France, the barricades, the demands for workers' rights, the campaign for women's rights, the white slave trade, and maybe above all, the Jews were also accused of being responsible for the plotting to start wars with all each other, all the countries of Europe against each other. The Jews were the scapegoat for all of those movements that were springing up, all of those demonstrations, struggles of the early decades of industrialization. Now, at the close of the 1800s, the Jewish life, despite the rise of modern anti-Semitism, Jewish life, especially in the closing decades of the 19th century, life for the Jews after emancipation has become, we can say, more secure. Jews were now more confident in their place in society. They were willing and able and actually made great contributions to the secular, the political, and in fact the economic order of society. They ran for office. They published books. I mean, this is the time of Karl Marx, of Sigmund Freud. This is the time of all of those great thinkers. And the Jews really had, at this point, accepted and integrated the fundamental premises of the Enlightenments, including, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that Jews needed to be improved. And as I said, they worked on themselves to achieve what their hosts, what their neighbors wanted them to achieve. And they strongly believed that through their collective progress, it would lead to finally, as their neighbors could see them as equals, as partners in the creation of those nation states, the Jews really saw that their involvement, their emancipation, their becoming citizens of those full-fledged citizens of those country, that would lead finally to the disappearance of hatred. And so for most Jews, this Judenfrage, this Jewish question, they had answered it. And it has been resolved. They did what they were told. They had proven themselves. They had become fully assimilated. They were Germans, full Germans. They were British. They were French citizens, as they were asked to become. And so these mostly urban Jews, as you can understand, like you and I, became more secular. They wore modern clothes. They learned and exclusively spoke their nation's language. And, they ate their food, including not so kosher. They really did all they were asked to do in order to finally, not just to be accepted, but to contribute to the nations that they felt had finally opened their doors to them. And as you can imagine, the backlash came as a great shock. What they didn't see, despite their effort, the blind spot in their endeavor, was that in fact Christians were not pleased with the emancipation. And I'll say something more specific. Christians were not pleased with how successful the emancipation was. First, though it might have changed these increasingly urban Jews, it did not really impact the more conservative, the more religious Jews who were unwilling, as far as the Christians were concerned, who were unwilling to erase their communal and psychological characteristics of Jewishness. Or more radically, as in fact Richard Wagner put it, they were not willing, as he says, and I quote, to engage in an act of self-extinction. Really? How could they? And so this persistent refusal of the Jews to disappear frustrated many Europeans, just as, by the way, if you remember from, I think, the first class, it was frustrating to the Greeks. It was frustrating to the Romans, to the church, and even, as we will see, to Islam. These Jews keep refusing to disappear. But there was something else. There was something that was new in this modern anti-Semitism. And what was new was modern parliamentary politics. Parties were vying for votes to gain greater power in the different assemblies of Europe. And nothing drives more votes to your cause, to your party, than fear. We know that very well. And so tapping into the anxieties of the moment, blaming and accusing was really an easy way to be noticed as a candidate. And the creation of anti-Semitic political parties, not just anti-Semitic political parties, as a way to gain popularity, really, continued with creation of anti-Semitic local associations, local clubs, all an array of local organizations, some based on economic concerns, some based on religious concerns, some outright based on racist principles. And that is one of the most important distinguishing feature of modern anti-Semitism, is that it permeated every aspect of society, from the individual to the communal, right, through the associations, the clubs, wherever you belong to in your spare time outside of work, and also in the political sphere. It was everywhere. And obviously each party, through their anti-Semitic platforms, were eager to promise a cure for all that ailed the modern world. And that was true whether on the left or on the right. Once again, the Jews were responsible for the ills of the modern world. And the proof, right, which is the second aspect, as I mentioned earlier, of the unique angst and anger with which Christians view the emancipation of the Jews, the successful emancipation of the Jews. The proof was that the Jews, as far as those left or right anti-Semitic parties were concerned, the Jews were clearly the one clear beneficiaries of an emancipation. They were the one clear beneficiaries, the winners, really, of mass politics. They were the winners of parliamentary democracy. They, more than anyone else, as they brandished their accusation, benefited from the expansion of personal freedom and the opening of the new economic order. No one had it as good as the Jews. The Jews went from 0 to 100, where the rest of us barely could get to 50%, whatever that is, right? And so all of those anti-Semitic parties, local group, local organization, local clubs, over that century and into the 20th century, dedicated themselves to reversing this ill-acquired gains that the Jews were able to make as a result of really what they saw as the too magnanimous emancipation that Christians of Europe mistakenly bestowed upon these hopeless Jews. And that was true not just across party lines, but that was true in most, if not all, countries of Europe. They saw the Jews as the one who were benefiting the most from modernity, where the rest of us, as the Christians would say, still struggled and suffered through this time. So in Germany, these political parties and local organization helped make anti-Semitism acceptable, and in some quarters, even respectable, right? I mean, that's what I meant by it is infusing all strata of the social, economic, and political sphere. And so to be an anti-Semite, especially in the higher echelon of society, becomes something not just, like I said, acceptable, but really respectable. It's almost like a card in those social circles. And everywhere, anti-Semitic discourse was out in the open. I mean, again, politicians ran on openly, overtly shared anti-Semitic political platforms as part of their program. And so everywhere we see pamphlets, easily published, no censorship. We see posters on the walls. We see publications of dozens and dozens and dozens of books, cartoons in newspapers and in magazines, all deriding Jews, all accusing them of all sorts of conspiracies and caricaturing their physical features. And the German anti-Semitic movement was extremely well organized and was able to spread their propaganda again through those clubs, through those societies, through those fraternities, many of them being very respectable organizations central to German society. And in fact, those anti-Semites drew on Germany's intellectual strength. They celebrated the country's pre-Christian Aryan Germanic roots, and they were building on the pseudoscience of the time and philosophy, all that combined together to produce now a new racial anti-Semitism. Because modern anti-Semitism is modern racial anti-Semitism, which declare that race, not religion, defined the Jew. And so even those Jews, and I mentioned that last time, with the Haskalah, with the Jewish Emancipation, with the Jewish Enlightenment movement, even Jews who converted to Christianity, remained racial Jews. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And in fact, the accusations went that it was through conversion and assimilation that the Jews entered German society to undermine it from within. Exactly the accusation leveled at the conversos by the church just 300 years earlier that led to the Inquisition. Now, we could have anticipated that history would indeed repeat itself, but the difference is with modern time is when the pyres of the church killed a few Jews at the time, ultimately the Nazis' ovens will reduce millions of Jews to ashes. So modern racial anti-Semitism also argued, also accused, also told their whomever was listening to the fact that the Jews were paradoxically much stronger than the Germans. Now that's a really, it's another time that I'm using the word paradoxical, but I think it's really interesting, and we need to really pay attention to that, because on one hand you have the Jew as the Übermensch, the low on the totem pole, the lowest actually on the totem pole of race hierarchy, right? Social Darwinism was, I'm not going to have the time to talk about social Darwinism, but we know that the pseudoscience of racial hierarchy places the Jews at the very bottom of the ladder. But at the same time, these Jews who supposedly were the worst of the worst, the least human of all, were also conniving enough, intelligent enough, smart enough to have this global reach to overthrow local governments and nation states in their pursuit of absolute global control of the planet. And so you have this impossibility that the Jews are at the very bottom and they at the same time at the top, right? And the anti-Semite warned their people, their listeners, of the strength of the global Jew. How much stronger than the German, than the Christian German, the Jew is. Again, it's living in this weird, impossible paradox. And this strength, which was, according to the anti-Semitic propaganda, was embedded in their racial characteristics, is what permitted the Jews to survive 1800 years of Christendom, which is also how they had achieved dominance over the West. And they were the preeminent power, the most powerful force on earth. And emancipation had given them a great disproportionate advantage over the weak, poor everyday German who is not a match to those Jews. And so these ideals of the Enlightenment, those ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, these ideals had in fact torn down the necessary barriers against the Jewish race. Those very barriers that had been erected for the protection of the Christian people. And that's where, as you can hear, modern racial anti-Semitism meets medieval anti-Judaism. And in fact, the last decade of the 1800s, at least 79 charges were laid against the Jews across Central and Eastern Europe for blood libel. Blood libel. We thought that this was a ghost of the past. The blood libel, the killing Christian children to make matzah with their blood. Remember that from the Middle Ages? There were 79 charges across Europe reclaiming the Jews were killing Christian children to make matzah. Blood libel. And there was one more. There was an 80th one that did not happen in Europe. That 80th one happened right here in America. So think about this last decade of the 1800s. And think about the soup, the anti-Semitic soup, spilling over in the early years of the 20th century, permeating all aspects of German society, of the Germanic world. And that soup is the soup Hitler was bathed in the very formative years of his life. Now we move from Germany to France, because France, again, wasn't much better. I mentioned earlier, all of those just crossed borders so easily. And the same accusations actually about how emancipation and the French Revolution was most benefiting the Jews. You see that all over writings and pamphlets and publications in France as well. The Jews were the winners of modernity. And all that had gone wrong with modernity were also blamed on the Jews in France as well. Whatever your special group, your special affiliation was against, there were Jews responsible for it. And by the end of the 19th century, anti-Semitism had become the central feature of the major political split in France that were opposing Republican radicals to the Royalist clericals. Those were the two parties. Republican radicals, that grouping was embracing of the ideals of the Enlightenment, and you can understand that those who were still royalists and clericals, right, those who used to be in power before the revolution, were pretty much against the ideals of the Enlightenment. And one of the most dramatic expressions of anti-Semitism and this conflict between those two very drastically opposed parts of France was the Dreyfus, l'affaire Dreyfus, the Dreyfus affair. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish army officer who was accused in 1894 of spying for Germany. And you can hear in that the long-standing trope that Jews' loyalty cannot be trusted, that they were the enemy who always is infiltrating our institution to undermine them from within, right? The same trope all the way back to the Inquisition, right? The Jews that infiltrate our institution to destroy them from within. And so, right, Alfred Dreyfus was a German sold to Germany to spy on, or to infiltrate the French army and spy on it. And the charges were based on completely forged documents, as well as a massive cover-up in the French military. And with that, easily, Dreyfus was found guilty of treason in a secret court-martial, during which he was completely denied the right to even examine the evidence against him. All of this, by the way, is documented, and you can learn about it anywhere. The army stripped him of his rank in what was a truly humiliating public ceremony in which his uniform was torn and his sword was broken. All the while, since this was out in public in the courtyard of a little army post in central Paris, all the while an enormous mob had gathered to watch, and hundreds and hundreds of French people shouted with rage, uncontrollable rage, "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" Now, Dreyfus was sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. But then the Dreyfus affair took on even greater significance 4 years later in 1898, when Émile Zola resurrected the cause of Dreyfus' innocence in his very famous J'accuse op-ed in one of the most prominent newspapers of the time, which was a stunning accusation, denunciation of the French army. Now, Émile Zola was on the Republican side of the conflict. Following the publication of his op-ed, the army retried Dreyfus and once again found him guilty and returned him back to Devil's Island in 1899. the story doesn't end there, because he was finally exonerated and pardoned in 1906. So he still spent 7 additional years on Devil's Island, when the real identity of the traitor and the details of the cover-up finally emerged in the public sphere. Dreyfus was restored to his rank, and he was later even awarded the Légion d'honneur, which is the highest French order of merit. But throughout, the nation of France was absolutely split between those two parties. Those who were pro-Dreyfus, they were called the Dreyfusards, and those who stood against him, I would call them the Anti-Semites. And the battle raged really for many, many years. And it was really a conflict between, again, it's like, it's the same thing that I've been saying that is so critical to understand. This is a conversation that the non-Jews French were having between themselves about this new French nation. And so the battle was between really those who supported and defended the French ideals of the revolution against those who opposed them, who didn't want the society as it was evolving. And I hate to make parallels that could be stretched, but what we see here is the level of separation, the level of division of the French nation along partisan and political lines is very much what we're seeing in America today. And those are always fodder for anti-Semitism. Now let me go back a few years at the time of the humiliation of Dreyfus, because as Dreyfus was publicly humiliating, stripping of his rank, there was a young journalist there. In fact, he was a foreign correspondent. He worked for a newspaper in Vienna, and he was assigned to cover French news on behalf of his newspaper back in Vienna. And he was there. He was there witnessing, and he was there to write an article on what had transpired. And he stood there, as he later wrote. He wrote a book, actually, that recalled this critical time in his life. He stood there, he writes, in absolute shock of the mob's repeated shouts, never-ending shouts of death to the Jews. And he writes that in that moment, he felt that he couldn't understand how in Paris, the birthplace of the Enlightenment, the country of liberty, of fraternity, of equality, how such violence could be hurled at the Jews. And this journalist, his name was Theodor Herzl. And Theodor Herzl, standing there, watching Dreyfus' sword being broken into two, understood that day, as he wrote soon after, that the days of the Jews living in Europe were numbered. Those were his words. And that the last 100 years of emancipation and progress, he writes, were only a fractured veneer covering an eternal hatred, the consequence of which, he feared, would be disastrous. He had a vision, an incredibly disturbing vision, that the Jews would not survive in Europe. And that was in 1894. little did he know of what was to come. And so his answer to the European Judenfrage, to the Jewish question, was very clear to him in that moment. And it became known as Zionism. He understood that Jews had to leave Europe before it was too late. And they had to find refuge, to take refuge in the land of their own. The land of their birth, ideally, their native land, the land that the Romans had renamed as Palestine. And that land, at the time of his writing, was the property of the Ottoman Empire. To the Judenfrage, to the Jewish question, like we saw before, some Jews answered with more assimilation. We're going to win them over if only we do more, if we assimilate more, right? Other Jews answered with simply remaining religious Jews that they've always been. They were not interested in the world that the Christians were inviting them into. They remain as they were prior to emancipation. That was their response to the Jewish question. Other Jews answered by joining socialist or communist movements because these movements promised them brotherly equality and actual true acceptance, unlike what they were living through in Western Europe. Herzl and his movement, his answer to the Jewish question was Zionism. And so Zionism, and it's very important for us to understand, because that's going to meet us to this day. Zionism was born as, and here's the definition, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That is what Zionism is. It is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. He was born in 1894. Herzl and those who created and grew the Zionist movement sought to advocate among the non-Jewish nations, right? Through what it was at the time the League of Nations. Some of us remember, at least I learned in school, about the League of Nations. That was the original United Nations, right? It existed between 1919 and 1946, and then the UN replaced it after 1946. Those Jewish leaders, those leaders of the Zionist movement, at the beginning with Herzl himself, and then after he passed, continuing his legacy, they pleaded with the League of Nations, with a non-Jewish nation, to be allowed, to be permitted to establish a national home, or more precisely, to return to their national homeland. So as a movement and an organization, that Zionism was created by Theodor Herzl in the late 1800s and ended in May 1948 with its fulfillment in Israel's Declaration of Independence. Right? The Zionist movement was over May 1948 when its purpose, its reason for being was fulfilled, and in fact there was a Jewish homeland. So Zionists today are those who simply hold as truth the right of the Jewish people to have and continue to have a national home to which they can return and live in peace and security. That's what we call those of us who are Zionists today. We hold as truth the right of the Jewish people to have and continue to have a national home to which we can return and live there in peace and security. Anti-Zionists, and we're going to talk a lot about them, are those who stand against this right, who deny this right to the Jews. And we will talk abundantly about that in a couple of weeks, and specifically around conversation about the BDS movement against Israel. But I don't want to give away too much. Now, we were in Germany. We moved to France with the Dreyfus affair. Now we have to take a little detour to Eastern Europe and Russia. I know I haven't talked about Russia. It's too big of a topic to cover, but we can't ignore Russia as we end the 1800s and step into the 1900s. And in a way, this is connected to Herzl, because the truth of the matter is that most of the Jews that will make their way back to the promised land and eventually lead to the creation of the state of Israel relocated there as refugees from the fierce, violent, devastating pogroms and extreme poverty Russia visited upon its Jews. And it will be important later when we talk about the attacks on the left, on the political left today here in America, the attacks against Israel that depict Israel as the creation of somehow a great white European colonizing force, conjuring up images of, West European armies, like the English subjugation of India, who reduced the local native populations of color to abject servitude while they plundered all their resources. That is kind of the picture that anti-Semites, especially on the political left, are painting about the Jews who returned to Israel. And as I will try to explain here, the early waves of Jewish immigration to the backwater, what was at the time the backwater province of the Ottoman Empire, that was, this region was called Palestine, were in fact not those evil white European, Western European colonizer, but in fact refugees of great deadly violence and persecution. As you would say today, Hondurans, Guatemalans, or Nicaraguans who are fleeing the violence and persecution in their country. Eastern European anti-Semitism, which again I don't have time to cover because it's a vast topic in and of itself, was nevertheless, up until the Nazis of the 20th century, the most virulent and violent against its Jews. Bar none. I have mentioned in previous sessions, the large massacres that plagued the Jewish communities of Western Europe through the centuries, sometimes, as I said, reaching horrendous proportions of tens of thousands of Jews being killed. But none came close, not even by a stretch of the imagination, to the butchery that was the Khmelnytsky, I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, the Khmelnytsky massacre of the infamous Cossack rebellion in the mid-1600s. This rebellion, which was mostly due to economic issues, this rebellion and the Cossacks traveling through mostly Ukraine slaughtered over 100,000 Jews. it really will take Nazi Germany to top that number. This was the greatest slaughter of Jews up until that moment in history. Now, throughout the 1800s, Russia had czars, the Romanovs family, who were publishing in each generation one harsh anti-Semitic decree after another. From 1825, the Jewish Pale of Settlement had come under Russian rule. And there may be a few people who don't know what the Pale of Settlement is. So let me just quickly share a picture so that you can see where this is taking place. So this area in green is where Jews were settled. You see that it's a cross between Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Bessarabia, what's called also New Russia. Most of American Ashkenazi Jews trace their family lineage to this area. This area not only became controlled by Russia, ultimately, it also, through the edicts of the Tsars, became the only place where Jews could reside. And so Jews were transported from other places around Russia to this area. Now think about, we're in the early 1900s now, right? Late 1800s, early 1900s. This is where the Jews live. On the left side of the map, you have the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Romania. On the right side of the map, you have Russia. Now, if you know your history, there are two world wars that are about to take place, in which forces of one side are going to try and invade the forces of the other side, and then those forces are going to retaliate and capture back the land, and then they're going to be this back and forth, east and west, all through this area. And each time those armies are going to travel through the only place where the Jews were allowed to live. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time in history. This is where the Jews were. And you can imagine that that population is quasi-extinct now, of the 3+ million Jews who lived in this area after the Second World War. So that's to give you a sense of where we are geographically. So from 1825, as I was saying, Russia controlled the Jewish Pale of Settlement. In 1881, things turned for the worse when the state purposefully now sought to exclude the Jews from the life of the state altogether. It's not enough to have relocated everybody to this geographical area. Now the Russians wanted to cut the Jews off completely, to leave them really to, once might say, to die on their own with no support from the state. And a series of laws, ordinances, began to be published to follow through with this project of the Tsars. And in addition to that, outbreaks of violence took place now that the Jews were really not protected by anyone. It was really a free-for-all, compiled with new form of accusations being leveled against the Jews every other day. And really that brought Russia in line with the ever-rising waves of anti-Semitism now across Europe, but in this case with more dramatic and devastating and obviously long-lasting consequences. Because this was different than what was going on in Western Europe, and we'll talk more about that next week, but this was anti-Semitism as state policy, and that was new. Jews now had extremely little access to any kind of economic opportunities. They were completely, if not banned, severely limited to access any form of education. They were easily expulsed from rural areas when the locals just decided they didn't need them or want them around anymore. And that obviously promoted within the Jewish community intense competition from the leftovers, if you want, the meager resources they could still cobble together. And poverty, extreme poverty, spread throughout the Jewish community of Eastern Europe. And that with the violence obviously caused waves of immigrations outside of the land of those Jews who looked for a better life somewhere else, including the few waves of immigration to Palestine at the time. And so more and more Jews are driven by the devastating poverty towards Zionism, but also towards socialism. Remember, we're still under the Tsar of Russia, right? But together with official government policy that, as I mentioned, targeted Jews exclusively, popular sentiment also hardened against the Jews. That was fueled by the ancient theological hatred, but it also came to explode in 1881 because of, again, seeing the Jews as the state's inner enemy. And there is going to be specific reasons for that, but overall, the Jews, because of the propaganda of the Tsar, because of the state-sponsored anti-Semitism, the masses come along and explode in violence. In 1881, a series of riots erupt and sweep through southern Russia with extreme violence. And those were not the first. Something of a much smaller scale had already devastated the Jewish communities of Odessa. Odessa is the further south on the map that I showed you. It's a port city that is, in fact, where a lot of Jews will immigrate to Israel, to Palestine. And there were a series of pogroms there in Odessa in 1859, and then again in 1871. But the riots of 1881 are known in Russian by the word pogrom, included unrestrained violence, mayhem, physical assault, and the complete destruction of Jewish property. And what provoked this pogrom was the fact that a group called, and I quote, the People's Will, which by all means was a terrorist organization, was displeased by the general policies of the Tsarist government and had this terrorist organization, the People's Will, had assassinated Tsar Alexander II by throwing a bomb in his carriage. Now, this was a large group, mind you. Hundreds of people belonged to the People's Will, to that terrorist organization. And among those hundreds of people was Hesia Helfman, one Jewish woman. To the anti-Semites, she immediately became the symbol of what they saw as a Jewish plot against Russia. A Jewish plot against Russia. And it was at the same time, in the same days, that very year, that Easter and Passover were one after the other. That all happened together with the assassination, and that created an explosive situation by which in mid-April the attacks against the Jews, first in southern Russia, but then spreading like wildfire, just engulfed the Jewish population of the Pale of Settlement. And the pogroms actually raged through 1883. In total, over those 2 years, there were accounted for 200 pogroms, 200 massacres. And you can imagine how that terror that shaped the Jewish community there, and the trauma and the scars that this left behind. And one can say that the government this time did not directly orchestrate the pogroms. It is also clear that we see that the local authorities, the security forces, rarely, if ever, intervene. And not only that, but the handful of perpetrators that ended up being arrested got the lightest sentences that could be given. And after that, even after that, more harsh laws followed, whereby now Jews could not buy or rent property other than the one they already own. They were now also banned from civil service jobs, and they were completely forbidden to do business on Sundays and on any Christian holidays. The years that followed, I don't have the space to tell you all of it or the time. You can just imagine piled more and more and more restrictions onto the already impoverished, destitute, famished Jewish Russian population. And there's one quote that I want to share by a very high-powered procurator in the Tsarist government, who remarked, and I quote, "The only way for the Jewish question to be solved in Russia was for a third of the Jews to immigrate, a third of the Jews to convert to Christianity, and a third of the Jews to die." And so you can imagine, if that comes from the highest echelon of the Tsarist government, that it's not going to do anything to stop the pogrom. And in fact, they continued through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, with one of the most violent in Kishinev on April 6, 1903. And then, in fact, throughout 1905, also continuing over 2 years. And those ongoing pogroms led to thousands of Jews dead and many thousand more wounded. And, you know, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, the pogrom at the end was a retelling of what happened in 1905. And in 1905, something else happened in Russia. The failure of the first revolution, anti-Tsarist revolution, by socialist and communist forces. And who was to blame for this aborted revolution the Jews, of course, and the revolutionary forces openly called for the total extermination of the Jews for their failure to deliver the overthrowing of the Tsar. So 1871, right, 1881, 1903, and 1905, those were the 4 critical years of pogroms, massacres in Russia. And if you open a book of the history of Zionism and the immigration of Jews to Palestine, these were the years, the exact years that mark the different waves of immigration, not just toward Palestine and the Ottoman Empire, but also to North America. Some of your ancestry might have come from come to America after one of those years. Also Argentina, South Africa, and obviously Western Europe. So you can see that those Jews who fled were not a group of rich, well-armed colonizer. They were a group of destitute, impoverished, famined refugees. Now, I'm going to close tonight, and it looks like I might go over time today, I'm sorry, with Russia's most lasting contribution to modern anti-Semitism. And that is the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. I'm going to show you the different and many different publications of this infamous pamphlet that has made it really throughout the world, unfortunately for the Jews, but throughout the world. So let me show you several versions of the cover of the protocols. Here's one in English. You can't probably not see it at the bottom, but this was published by a publishing company in Connecticut. So this is an American version. I'll talk about actually the American version throughout the next few sessions. Here you have, and I'm going to blow it up a little bit, one of the most famous, also translated in English, by the Russian author, with a picture of the Jew behind the curtain, right? Who plots everything behind the curtain, and in German, here it says the Jew. That's another one. I think there were more, but I think we get a sense. I had one in Spanish. Let me see if it's easily accessible. If not, you kind of get the sense of what is there. Oh, this one was interesting. I found this one from a website here in America called Jesus Was Not a Jew. That was the name, literally the name of the website. And on the homepage of their website, they advertised the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I just wanted to mention that because I thought the website itself, Jesus Was Not a Jew, was clearly anti-Semitic. And this is the publication in Spanish. Again, by Sergei Nilis, who is the original author. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. You can see how the Jews are depicted right there as well. So just to give you a sense of how far and wide this publication has gone. It was concocted by members of the Russian secret police, of the Russian spies in Paris. Sometimes it's dated to be between 1896 and 1898, so we're not exactly sure. And it's a book that pretends to be the protocol of the minutes of a meeting of supposed Jewish elders who are plotting world domination. Now, the accusations were not limited to this or that particular country in this case. The protocol portrays the Jews as conspiring on a global scale to encourage the most hated forces of modernity. And in the book, page after page, they condemn the Jews to be responsible for liberalism, for capitalism, for anarchism, for Marxism, socialism, and parliamentary democracy all at once. They hit all of them in one pamphlet. Both the Russian Revolution of 1917 and then Germany's defeat in World War I turned the protocols from being just another anti-Semitic pamphlets, and I told you there were a lot, into the Bible for anti-Semites the world over. And I don't mean that lightly. The anti-Semitic forces have circulated the protocols during the Russian Civil War to prove that the overthrow of the Tsar was in fact a Jewish revolution. In post-war Germany, the protocol was used to prove that the Jews were promoters of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy to conquer the nation. Right? Again, complete opposites. And after World War I, the book began to enjoy wide success in Western Europe and then traveled far beyond that. And I want to talk again in the version, the American version, that I showed you in the slides. The American version was published in the US and was completely financed, the publication of which was 100% financed by Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the car maker. And he made sure to make it absolutely available to anyone walking in a Ford dealership. Now, I will mention Henry Ford again a few times in this course, unfortunately, in different contexts. But I want to post here, I'm going to do that in the chat room right now, in just a second. A fascinating article about Ford's disturbing role in not only endorsing and paying for the publication and spread of the protocols throughout America, but through his own books and his own newspaper, which he owned, making himself the key promoter of anti-Semitism in America. The cornerstone of 20th century anti-Semitism in America is the birth child of Henry Ford. And it's still, his books, his publications, still inspire many radical anti-Semites to this day. So let me just put that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to share, first of all, I'm going to post that link for every one of you who want to click in the chat room to get it. You can click on it and then it will pop into your browser. You don't have to watch it right now. You can read it later. It's an amazing article. But I'm going also to share my screen to show those who are watching on YouTube, not that one, watching on YouTube, this one. The name of the article. So it's called Henry Ford and the Jews, and if you want to Google it, you can do that right now. The story Dearborn didn't want told. And if you see here at the top left corner, it's from Bridge, Michigan. That's the website. So if you Google Bridge, Michigan, Henry Ford and the Jews, the story Dearborn didn't want told, you should find this page. It's a remarkable, fascinating article. Read it between now and the next class. Okay, so I think I have just a few more things to talk about, specifically the protocols of the Elders of Zion. You can imagine that they were enthusiastically embraced by the Nazis. And they are also currently the all-time bestseller in the Muslim world. And we will see that in a couple of weeks. Okay, that's all I have for today. I just want to remind you to let you know that next week we have the privilege to welcome a staff member of the Holocaust Center for Humanity here in Seattle. They're here in Seattle, who will talk to us about this other version of state-sponsored anti-Semitism and the devastation that the power of the state can inflict. And you will see that is a complete departure from individual or even group or even political party anti-Semitic attacks, and really a true leap in violence when it is state organized. So that is all I have for tonight, but I'm happy to answer a few questions. I hope this was enlightening, since he was talking about the century of the Enlightenment. I hope it was. And you can really see a lot of now what we see today as being also born at that time. If there's one or two questions, I am happy to indulge. You can raise your little hand. Where it says reactions at the bottom of your screen, if you hover over that, it says raise hand. You can do that, and then I'll call upon you. All right. Again, we're only going to do first names. So Kate. You have to unmute yourself.
Not a question. I just want to remark that last time Rich had mentioned a couple of books, and I read one of them. I have to say, it was the Umberto Eco. In a way, I would recommend it because it just gives a wealth of information and background on what you were talking about tonight. I found the first couple, maybe 100 pages, really amusing in the hatred that this narrator has for everybody, not only for Jews, but for lots of other people. And so it was. It gave me a good laugh, and then it got kind of tiresome. And by the end, I was so glad to be done with it.
But you highly recommend it.
Yeah, it gives a very good background to the protocols, I have to say.
So Umberto Eco, what's the name of the book?
The Prague Cemetery.
Okay.
It all takes place in France, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So you
a misnomer.
Too, but yeah.
All right. Very good. Thank you, Kate. Rich, you also raised your hand?
Yeah, I agree with Kate. And the reason I recommended the book was because it's taken from the point of the view of what we would today call a right-wing conspiracy nut.
Say again?
And it kind of presented, Eco was trying to present the way these people think.
Yeah.
The way they thought. And I think he did a good job of that. But there are parts of the book that are slow going.
All right. Well, very good. Somebody's asking a question in the chat about great books about the Pale of Settlement. Oh, I don't know on top of my head any specific book about this. I'm sure you can type those words "Pale of Settlement" in on your Amazon search, and some things will pop up, and just choose the one you'd like to read. All right, one more question, anyone? If not, we can just call this night a night. I don't know if this is your first, your last name, but Moriel, just unmute yourself, please.
Hey, Rabbi. I just have a question. I have ancestors that lived in the Pale of Settlement, and I have very little information on them on both sides of my family.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious if the Jews that ended up in the Pale of Settlement, if they were primarily all Ashkenazi Jews, or if there were Jews from the Caucasus region.
They were Jews from the Caucasus region. They were Jews from Turkey. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. The most of the southern part, so understand that the borders were different than today, and people traveled in different, so yeah, there were great influence actually in those areas from Turkish Jews and that actually moved there. We know that I did a course on the history of Hasidism. And we know that Hasidism, which for us seems to be really so much of an Ashkenazi sect of Judaism, in fact had a lot of influence from Middle Eastern Jews and Turkish Jews who traveled and traded. There were a lot of trade going on. So no, they were it was not just as homogeneous and as we sometimes tend to think.
Thank you.
Yeah, and people who do like 23andMe and who do their DNA testing, they're oftentimes they're surprised when it comes back with, well, you have Middle Eastern roots. Like, no, my family's from Belarus, and it's like, how can I? Well, because he was not it was much more fluid than we think. Sherry, just unmute yourself.
Were there non-Jews living in the Pale of Settlement?
Yes, of course. If you look at the map, there were major cities. I can show it again. Give me a second. There were major cities that where the Jews actually were banned from living. Come on. So if you look on the map, all the red square, which is funny because it was Russian, are cities that were forbidden for Jews to live.
Okay.
Yeah. So there were. This was not just Jews. I understand. This was completely mixed population.
Okay.
Yes.
And
All right. Back to Sherry.
one last question. How do you spell that Jewish Army officer's name?
Dreyfus?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just posted in the chat. Dreyfus.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Unmute yourself, Sherry, and then we can hear your question.
Okay, sorry. I kept turning the volume button. I just wanted to ask you to please repeat the name of the group that the person is coming next time.
Oh, this is the Holocaust Center for Humanity. There, it's the group that also organizes and curates the Holocaust Museum downtown. We've been there with Bet Aleph. They had a whole display of the Anne Frank story some years ago, and we took our bar mitzvah program, our kids and some members. It's a really incredible work they're doing. You should, yeah, look them up. They're really active, fighting anti-Semitism around here and trying to educate people. We have actually connected them to the North Shore School District where my kids have been going, so that they can work with the schools to teach Holocausts, which is not taught right now or barely. So they're doing a lot of great work. They're great.
They have a program every Tuesday at noon, from noon to 1.
Yes, they have a lunch, right? Lunch, yeah. Which I can never go because I lead the meditation at noon. So I'm hoping that the person from the group that will come next week will talk a little bit about their work, and then talk about pre and post Holocaust anti-Semitism. I'm not really interested in the Holocaust itself. I think that's such a huge topic that it would take another 12 sessions to barely cover that. But I'm interested in the leading up to, and how state-sponsored anti-Semitism grow and is built in, and then becomes the trap that the Jews eventually became trapped in. And then also, we're not very aware of that. There were still attacks, anti-Semitic attacks and acts right after the Holocaust, right at the end of the war, in Poland and in all of those areas. You would think after the war people would say, okay, but in fact it continued. So I've invited them to talk about that, because I could talk about that, but they are the experts, and they're right here downtown, and they were co-sponsors of the course. So I said, hey, would you like to take that session, because who better than you to do it? So they graciously accepted, and I'm really looking forward to be a participant in the class next week. Thank you for your question, Sherry. I think we're going to leave it here tonight, folks. Thank you for staying late, and we'll see you. We're going to do a shalom chant, and then we'll gather back again next week. So if you're still wanting to close the session with those energies, I invite you to close your eyes. We enter in peace, and we leave in peace. And if you want to chant, take a breath for shalom. Thank you. Laila Tov. Good night, everybody.
Laila Tov, Rabbi.
Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi. Toda Rabba.
Bevakasha.
Merci beaucoup. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. That's right. It's already the 4th. It's almost the end of 2022. Let's make sure we take care of that. All right. Bye, everybody.